June 24th, 1941. Near the town of Rezegh in western Lithuania, the dawn is already bright. By the time the German 6th Panzer Division begins to move again, the column stretches down the road in a long metallic spine. Trucks, fuel Bowsers, light Panzer 35s, and the half-tracks kicking dust into the early summer air. Their orders are simple and urgent. Push east, cross the rivers, keep the drive on Leningrad moving. A few hundred meters ahead, the road curves past a patch of woodland and a small rise. Somewhere beyond that bend, reconnaissance has reported scattered Soviet resistance, but nothing serious. The advance guard expects artillery, perhaps, not much more. Then at roughly a kilometer, the shape appears. Not a fleeing truck, not a field gun. A single hulking Soviet heavy tank, one of the KV series, sits astride the road, angled slightly, its silhouette absurdly high against the trees. It is alone, but it is parked squarely across the German supply route, as if it has no intention of moving at all. German drivers hit their brakes, engines cough and idle. Somewhere in the column, watches are checked. Every minute they sit here, Soviet forces to the north have more time to regroup. If the advance guard keeps fleeing at even 20 kilometers per hour, they'll be in effective range in less than 3 minutes. But against a tank whose armor, their standard 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns, have already proved useless, 3 minutes might simply be the countdown to destruction. The German commander of the forward Kampfgruppe now faces a brutal decision. Attempt to bypass the monster and risk having the entire column shredded from the flank, or halt the advance of an entire panzer division, while they drag forward heavier guns under the nose of a tank that can kill them out to well over a kilometer. He chooses to stop, to bring up artillery, to call for the famous 8.8 centimeter flak. And as the first anti-tank guns are manhandled into position at about 900 yards, the Soviet turret begins slowly, deliberately to traverse. This is the story of the forgotten tank battles of the Second World War. Battles like Rezegh, Sidi Rezegh, and Coriano Ridge, clashes of steel and doctrine that changed campaigns, and in some cases strategic plans, yet are almost sort of mentioned beside the great set-piece names, Kursk, El Alamein, Normandy, Stalingrad. Yet these are the battles that almost nobody talks about, but should. Most people's mental map of World War II tank warfare is built around a handful of iconic images: Tigers dueling T-34s in the snow near Kursk, Shermans rolling through the hedgerows of Normandy, or panzers charging across the desert under Rommel's command. Those moments mattered, of course, but they sit atop a much larger, rougher terrain of lesser-known engagements where doctrine was tested, logistics strained, and the limits of each tank design were exposed. By late June 1941, on the Eastern Front, German armor doctrine was riding high. Panzer divisions had carved through Poland and France with a mix of speed, coordination, and air support that stunned opponents. The assumption in many German headquarters was blunt. Soviet armor would collapse the same way. The main obstacles, they believed, would be distance and supply, not enemy tanks. The Battle of Rezegh shattered that illusion. The Soviet 3rd and 12th Mechanized Corps, including the 2nd Tank Division, threw hundreds of tanks, many obsolete but some modern, against the German 4th Panzer Group. Among them were heavy KV-1s and KV-2s that German crews had never seen before. Sloped armor, thick plates, and heavy guns allowed some of these vehicles to shrug off dozens of hits from standard anti-tank weapons. In one of the most famous episodes, a single KV heavy tank pushed beyond Soviet lines and planted itself across a key road near Rezegh, halting the advance of Kampfgruppe Raus for most of a day. At roughly 900 meters, German anti-tank crews opened fire. Their 50-millimeter shells struck and bounced. The KV did not back away, and accounts describe it firing back with methodical precision, smashing gun after gun. Every time German vehicles tried to close the distance to perhaps 300 to 400 meters, where even a glancing shot at a vision slit or a track might disable the beast, they had maybe 30 to 40 seconds of movement under direct fire. For many of them, that was all the time they would ever get. Inside the KV, if reports are accurate, the situation was not as invulnerable as it looked from outside. Ammunition was limited. Fuel was low. The tank was essentially isolated, with little realistic hope of a recovery once German forces worked around it. The crew faced a stark tactical dilemma. Stay in place and continue to block the road at all costs, or attempt to withdraw and rejoin friendly lines, risking bogging down or being destroyed in the open. They chose to stay, and that choice delayed an entire panzer division at a critical phase of Operation Barbarossa. For every hour the road stayed blocked, German units further east had to operate with thinner supply columns, fewer shells, and lesser fuel. At the operational level, the German advance in that sector continued, and ultimately, Rezegh ended in a German victory. But this single tank action exposed a dangerous assumption. The Wehrmacht's lighter tanks and guns could not be relied upon to dominate every engagement. There were Soviet machines in certain circumstances and terrain that could take everything they had and return fire. The reversal came when German commanders adapted under pressure. Heavy 8.8 centimeter anti-aircraft guns were dragged into position, used in a role that would become legendary. Long-range tank killers, camouflaged, and firing from outside the KV's immediate field of view, they eventually penetrated its armor. The lonely tank was silenced, but the lesson remained. A wake-up call that German officers would carry into every subsequent encounter with Soviet heavy armor. And almost no one outside specialist history circles talks about Rezegh today. Yet, for the crews in those columns and the officers who watched their supposedly superior doctrine stall in front of a single tank, this obscure clash was as sharp and unforgettable as any scene at Kursk. 3 years later, and more than 2,000 kilometers to the southwest, another lesser-known battle of tanks was unfolding, this time among the low ridges and stony expanses of the Libyan desert. Sidi Rezegh. In November 1941, Operation Crusader was launched by the British Eighth Army. Yet the goal was clear and urgent: break the siege of Tobruk, defeat the Afrika Korps in the open desert, and regain Cyrenaica. The plan depended heavily on British armored formations, especially the veteran 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, sweeping around the Axis flank, seizing its key airfields at El Adem and Sidi Rezegh, and drawing German panzers into a decisive battle. On paper, the British had numbers on their side. Hundreds of Crusader tanks, fast and agile, were available. But in practice, the equation was far more complicated. Crusaders suffered from mechanical issues in the harsh desert environment. Their armor was relatively thin, and their 2-pounder guns lacked high explosive shells, limiting their usefulness against anti-tank guns and dug-in positions. German Panzer III and IV tanks, fewer in number, were backed by disciplined German crews, flexible tactics, and a dense web of 50mm and 88mm anti-tank guns. On the open desert near Sidi Rezegh, armored brigades on both sides began to converge. Imagine a British armored regiment advancing at around 20 kilometers per hour across rough ground, closing on what appears to be a line of German panzers at 2,000 meters. The combined closing speed might be on the order of 30 to 40 kilometers per hour. That means that in roughly 3 minutes, the range will drop into the deadly 800 to 1,000 meter band, where German guns are particularly effective. British commanders faced a wrenching decision point again and again. Do they press the attack in line, hoping to overwhelm with numbers and speed, or swing wide and risk losing contact, giving the Afrika Korps time to reposition, counterattack, or slip away? During one of the crucial days of fighting, 23rd November, the 5th South African Brigade near Sidi Rezegh was overwhelmed and largely destroyed, even as it inflicted heavy losses on German armor. British tank brigades were ground down, often fighting without close infantry or artillery support, dispersing instead of concentrating. The result was a tactical disaster. In a matter of days, British forces lost hundreds of tanks, around 530, compared to roughly 100 Axis tanks in the same early phase of the operation. Yet, Crusader as an operation did not end as a failure. The twist here, the larger reversal, came not from a single battlefield success, but from attrition and stubborn persistence. Flommel's forces, tactically brilliant at Sidi Rezegh, simply could not sustain their losses and logistical strain. British and Commonwealth units, so battered and reorganized, kept coming. In the end, the siege of Tobruk was lifted. The cost was staggering, and the battlefield around Sidi Rezegh became a graveyard of burned-out tanks from both sides. This obscure desert tank battle changed the balance in North Africa. It proved that even when British armored doctrine faltered, when Crusader tanks dashed forward without proper combined arms coordination, the sheer depth of Allied resources and the corrosive effect of constant pressure could force the Afrika Korps to yield. But Sidi Rezegh is often reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by the more famous name, El Alamein. If North Africa was a laboratory of mobility, and open desert maneuver. Italy was the opposite, a long, mountainous, mud-choked grind, where tanks were as likely to be used as mobile pillboxes as they were for sweeping advances. Nowhere is this more evident than at Coriano Ridge in September 1944. As part of the drive through the Gothic Line, the last major German defensive barrier across the Italian peninsula, the British 8th Army and the Canadian 1st Corps assumed to break through toward the Po Valley. Coriano Ridge, a modest rise in the countryside southeast of San Marino, became a linchpin. German forces, including the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division and elements of the 26th Panzer Division, turned it into a heavily defended bastion of anti-tank guns, mortars, and dug-in infantry. British 1st Armored Division and 5th Canadian Armored Division were tasked with a difficult job: push armored and infantry brigades over narrow, winding approach routes under observation and then pry the Germans off the ridge itself. Reports from the time describe roads that, even today, twist and snake through the hills. In 1944, chewed up by rain, shellfire, and heavy vehicles, they became bottlenecks. Picture a squadron of Shermans edging forward at barely 10 kilometers per hour along a narrow road at night, trying to close the last kilometer to a forming up point before dawn. They might have 6 minutes before first light exposes them to German observers on the ridge. But a single knocked-out tank burning at a tight bend could block the entire route, and it cost them an hour or more of precious darkness. Commanders had to decide: risk moving earlier in darkness and confusion, or accept that first movement might be under full daylight and enemy observation. At Coriano, they pressed forward. British infantry brigades advanced from the west, Canadian infantry and armor from the south, all under the cover of massed artillery, hundreds of guns firing rolling barrages. Tanks often fought at close range, struggling for hold-down positions in terrain that simply did not favor them. The Italian campaign had already revealed the limitations of many Allied tanks' armor and firepower when forced into frontal assaults on fortified, elevated positions. At Coriano, those weaknesses were magnified. The twist here was the terrain itself. Many Allied planners spoke in optimistic terms about fluid operations once the Gothic Line was breached. Instead, the Germans used every ridge and valley to stage stubborn, localized defenses, repeatedly forcing Allied armor into predictable avenues of approach. Coriano Ridge became a case study in how even relatively small patches of ground could dictate the tempo and cost of armored warfare. Yet, the sector of Coriano Ridge opened the way toward Rimini and ultimately contributed to the progressive collapse of German defenses in northern Italy. The tanks that clawed their way up those slopes were not doing anything as dramatic-looking as the landings at Normandy, but their slow, grinding successes mattered for the shape of the post-war map. And again, few people talk about Coriano when they talk about tanks in Italy. Across these three battles, WWII, Sidi Rezegh, Coriano Ridge, certain patterns emerge, patterns that are easy to miss if we only look at the headline engagements. First, the tension between armor, firepower, and reliability. as Soviet 5 tanks at Rezegh were terrifyingly tough from the front, but heavy, slow, and mechanically vulnerable. Once cut off, they could inflict disproportionate damage but not survive a coordinated response indefinitely. British Crusader tanks at Sidi Rezegh were fast and nimble, designed to exploit open desert. Yet their thin armor and fragile mechanical systems turned speed into a gamble. Shermans and Churchills in Italy had better reliability, but in the close Italian terrain, their armor and guns could not always offset the advantage of Germans firing down from concealed, elevated positions. Each design came with trade-offs: armor thickness versus mobility, gun size versus turret space and crew comfort, reliability versus cost, and production speed. Doctrines were written, revised, and sometimes torn up entirely in the face of what actually happened when steel met steel. Second, the decisions under pressure. At Rezegh, German commanders who had once been confident in the supremacy of their panzers found themselves improvising under the threat of a single enemy tank, rerouting units and deploying 88s just to clear a road. At Sidi Rezegh, British brigadiers had to choose between dispersing to cover more desert and concentrating to punch a hole. Decisions measured not in neat arrows on maps, but in minutes of exposure to enemy guns and the dwindling number of operational tanks. At Coriano, armored officers wrestled with questions of timing and mass. Push up the ridges before full infantry support arrives, and at risk being picked off, or wait for a perfect combined assault, while the enemy digs deeper and the weather worsens. In each case, the micro-tensions of time, distance, ammunition, and fuel forced choices that would never make it into grand strategic speeches, but did determine who lived and who died, who advanced and who retreated. Third, adaptation and counter-adaptation. German forces learned quickly from encounters like Rezegh, integrating heavy anti-aircraft guns into anti-tank roles and adjusting tactics to avoid frontal duels with Soviet heavy armor. Soviet and later Allied forces studied German mobile defenses, including actions like Targu Frumos in Romania. It's where German and Romanian units used rapid counterattacks and flexible reserves to blunt Soviet armored spearheads, battles later cited in NATO staff colleges as examples of how to conduct mobile defense. In North Africa, British units slowly refined their use of artillery and air power in support of tanks, learning from hard experience at places like Sidi Rezegh. By the time of later battles, there was greater emphasis on combined arms coordination, not just tank versus tank duels. In Italy, Allied forces gradually increased the infantry component in their armored divisions, recognizing that tanks could not operate effectively without close infantry to clear anti-tank positions, hold ground, and exploit gains. Coriano Ridge was not just a tank fight. It was a combined test of artillery, infantry, engineering, and armor, and all forced into cooperation by unforgiving terrain. These minor battles were, in reality, experiments written in fire and steel, experiments whose results shaped later operations. And finally, there is the question of memory. We remember Kursk as the great tank battle. We remember Normandy and El Alamein because they've been named, mythologized, and revisited in film and literature. But for many of the men who fought in tanks, the defining engagement of their war was not a famous clash, but some ridge, some airfield, some river crossing whose name barely makes it into a footnote. A blocked road in Lithuania, where a single KV heavy tank held up a German division for most of a day. An airfield in the Libyan desert, where a brigade was shattered, but helped to turn the strategic tide. A ridge in Italy, where tanks climbed into mud and fire to pry open the last line of German defenses. These battles changed campaigns. They altered timetables. They forced doctrines to shift, designs to be reconsidered, and commanders to think differently about how tanks should be used. And yet, almost nobody talks about them. Perhaps that is the final lesson of these untold tank battles, that history is not only made in the moments that become famous. It is also made in the obscure, the local, the marginal engagements where crews fought in vehicles that were far from perfect, under doctrines that were still being written, in places that very few people can now find on a map. If you have family stories, regimental histories, or local memories connected to Rezegh, Sidi Rezegh, Coriano Ridge, or other little-known tank battles, those are part of this wider, hidden landscape of the war. They deserve to be heard. If you'd like to hear more stories like this of battles and machines that shaped the war from the shadows, consider subscribing. But above all, share what you know. Because every time one of these forgotten engagements is remembered, the picture of the Second World War becomes just a little bit clearer. And somewhere on a quiet road in Lithuania, in a wind-swept desert near an old airfield, and on a ridge in the Italian countryside, the ghosts of those tanks and their crews step a little closer into the light.